Hello, anthropology students, and welcome to week 14, where we continue talking about Homo sapiens. Last week, we talked about the origins of our species, how Homo sapiens evolved in Africa about 200,000 years ago from Homo heidelbergensis. And we talked about things like encephalization, our unusually large brains, and some problems and solutions that creates, mainly in the context of babies and childhood, and the fact that we evolved to be cooperative breeders. And that's how we pulled off getting these giant brains that we hopefully are using all the time. Okay, so what we're going to do this week is continue on from those ideas. And we're going to get into some more behavioral changes that we see with our species. We're going to look at this idea of evidence for a cognitive revolution. And we're going to begin to look at the timing and the spread of Homo sapiens out of Africa to other parts of the world. So let's take a look at that. Okay. So I believe I showed you this chart last week, and I talked about these two fossil sites, Homo Kabish and Herto, both in Ethiopia. These were the skull fragments at 190,000 years ago that looked to be Homo sapiens. These were the skulls at 160,000 years ago that were definitely Homo sapiens. So we had fully modern Homo sapiens, physically modern, anatomically modern Homo sapiens here in Africa, probably starting at around 200,000 years ago. Then we get some more fossil sites throughout Africa and into the Middle East, and then into East Asia and Southeast Asia, and all the way through like Australia and Europe. Okay, so we can see sort of this movement of Homo sapiens in finding their fossils anyway. All right, so what this shows us is we have physically modern Homo sapiens in Africa 200,000 years ago, and then we see them spread around. But there is a debate about whether or not those first Homo sapiens are fully cognitively modern, right? That they have modern mental abilities. Because some of the evidence for modern ways of thinking appear later in the fossil record, or seem to. So this has led some researchers to this idea of a cognitive revolution, meaning a revolution in our brains and in our way of thinking. And the time frame for this has been, it looks like it happened maybe around 40,000 years ago. And the location for it is usually attributed to being in Europe. Okay. So what this idea sets up is that even though our bodies became modern 200,000 years ago back in Africa, there was a delay in our mental abilities, and our modern mental abilities came in later, around 40,000 years ago in Europe. So that's what we're going to look at now in the lecture today is, was there a sudden change in the intelligence and behavior of Homo sapiens around this time? So if I go back to the chart I just showed you a minute ago, is those are the fossils, right, of Homo sapiens. But this cognitive revolution idea is suggesting around here, something different is happening in the brain, a cognitive revolution. And brains don't fossilize, so we don't see a change in the fossils, but we do see a change in other things that are associated with the fossils. Okay, so one of the things we have looked at over the past few weeks are tools, okay? And what was it, like a month ago when we started talking about stone tools? Remember those Oldowan stone tools that Homo habilis was using, which was basically just a sharp rock designed to chop up some, scrape some meat off of a carcass. So if we look at the types of tools that were made, Oldowan were very simple, just like one or two types. Then we got to Homo erectus, making the Acheulean hand axe was their main tool, and then a few others associated with them. Then we got into Homo heidelbergensis, making Levallois tools. There was a bit more of those, maybe a half dozen or so. Then we got into Neanderthals making Mousterian tools, and there were many more types of tools that Neanderthals were making, a dozen or so. When we get to Homo sapiens, during the Upper Paleolithic, this time period, around 40, 50,000 years ago, we see basically an explosion in the number of stone tools and types of tools that are being made. So it's this sort of exponential growth in the types of tools. So we see new changes and new advancements in tools, and there's much more rapid change than we saw in the previous species. And we see tools varying by location and time period. So this is really different than what we saw with like Homo erectus a few weeks ago. Homo erectus made that cool looking hand axe, right? It was kind of shaped like this. And they made it, and they kept making that hand axe for 1 million years, and all the Homo erectus used it. That's not the same as what's going on during this time period with Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens are not all using the same kind of tool. Different groups have different tool types, and they don't keep the same tool for 1 million years. They're changing it much more rapidly. So I don't have any one tool type to tell you that Homo sapiens make, because Homo sapiens during this time period are making lots of different styles of tools. And we start to see new tools that we did not see before. We see particularly new hunting weapons, things to get food from the water, things to hunt from a distance. So I'll highlight a few sort of the new things we see during this time period with Homo sapiens. One would be, we see finally, for the first time, tools and weapons specifically designed to go after fish. There was some suggestion a few weeks ago that Heidelbergensis was starting to eat fish, because we saw fish bones every now and then in there in the fossil sites. But now we're seeing things like fishing hooks, spears designed to prevent slippery fish from sliding off the end of it. So they are clearly intentionally going after fish and designing their tools to get that resource. So this is new during this Upper Paleolithic period. And then, probably one of my favorite inventions is the atlatl. Okay, an atlatl, otherwise known as a spear thrower, starts to show up during this time period. And this looks like a very, in some respects, very simple invention. It's basically just a stick with a notch on the end of it. Okay. But what this does is it's used for throwing spears, right? And you hold this stick back like this, it has a little notch, and then you set your spear on the end of it and use it to throw your spear and launch your spear. And it dramatically increases the power of your arm at throwing things. I don't know if any of you have ever gotten to use an atlatl. Maybe at some sort of camp or something. I hope some of you have gotten a chance to use it, but maybe not most of you. However, I should point out that probably a lot of you have actually used an atlatl but didn't realize what you were using. Have you ever used those things to throw balls, tennis balls for dogs, with the little cup on the end? It's usually made out of plastic about this long, and you can scoop up the ball and throw it. That is an atlatl, okay? That was invented during the Paleolithic, right? At least 20,000 years ago is when that tool was invented. And it was designed to throw spears. Now we mostly use it to throw tennis balls for dogs. And if you've ever tried one, you can throw that tennis ball much farther and much easier, right? And wear your dog out with putting in very little effort. That's what this is, and that's where it came from, right? So why I like this invention so much is because this revolutionizes hunting for Homo sapiens. You remember Neanderthals from a couple of weeks ago, how they were hunting? Like mammoths, they had to walk up to a mammoth and stab it with a big thrusting spear. Homo sapiens are not doing that. They're standing way the hell back, safely out of reach of these animals, and launching their spears at them from a distance. Okay. So it's basically the difference between hunting with a knife and hunting with a rifle, right? This allows for distance hunting with projectile weapons. So this is a huge advancement in hunting technology. Okay. All right, excuse me. So what we see is advancements in tools, in weapons, and we see other advancements that suggest changes in the brains of these Homo sapiens. And we start to see things like arts, okay? Cave art in particular is worth looking at here. So they have found evidence of cave art all over Europe, lots of examples in France and Spain. And some of these cave paintings and drawings are done very deep inside caves, so they're really well preserved, right? No wind or rain or erosion can get to them. They're preserved deep in caves. So I want to show you an example of this. So I'm going to show you Chauvet Cave. They discovered it back in the mid-90s, and they found these cave paintings deep inside a cave. And they've done dating on the paintings, and it looks like they were done around 33,000 years ago. Okay. So quite old. And cave art will probably show up in some of your other classes, like sometimes like world prehistory or the history of arts, those kind of classes. You may see this too. But I would just want to give you an idea of what the cave art in Chauvet looks like. So I'm going to go through a few slides and I'll be quiet so you can just enjoy the artwork for a minute. I will briefly interrupt the silence here for a second to say, while you're looking at this, these are two-dimensional PowerPoint pictures. They can only capture so much. But what you can kind of see here is that these are done on three-dimensional cave walls, right? So there's a lot of depth and texture to these that I can't quite capture in a PowerPoint. But there, now I'll let you look at the pictures. Okay, so a few things I want you to think about, and we can talk about in the discussion board this week, is why. Why are they taking the time and effort to make these cave drawings, right? What is the purpose of doing this? Okay. And keep in mind, these are some of these are pretty sophisticated drawings, certainly better than my ability. They're done very far back in caves. This takes time and effort. So give me some ideas in the discussion this week of what you think the purpose of doing this is. And also what I want you to think about is if you have an idea of what could be behind this, right? Like, why are they doing this? I want you to then, once you've formulated an idea of the purpose, sort of close your eyes for a minute and picture the artist, right? Picture the person doing these drawings. I want you to give me an idea of who you think made them, right? Like, who's that image of the artist that you have? Who is it? Who's the person in the group or the people in the group making them, right? Um, you know, is it somebody with a specific role? Is it, was your image of the artist, what age were they? What sex were they, right? Male, female, young, old, that kind of thing. Give me an idea of who you think made the art. And another thing to think about is why didn't we see this with any of the earlier species, right? Why didn't we see this with Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis or Erectus, right? Why is this only showing up with Homo sapiens? What makes Homo sapiens different that they're making this kind of artwork? And again, two-dimensional PowerPoint pictures on whatever device you're looking at can only go so far. You can look up, there's various documentaries and films about cave art that are pretty cool. There's one called Cave of Forgotten Dreams that's specifically about Chauvet Cave. So if you want to sort of learn a bit more about the cave art, you can look up some resources like that. All right, so we'll talk about these ideas in the discussion board. And not only are we seeing cave arts during this Upper Paleolithic time period, but we're seeing other sorts of artwork show up. We're seeing carved figures, right? And this would be broadly classified as symbolic art, right? You're carving little items to symbolize something else. And we start seeing human figures here. It's true, we don't see a lot of human figures in Chauvet Cave. There's some other caves that show human figures, but apparently not in Chauvet. But they're making human figures in small carvings. These are just a few inches long. They're not big, massive things. They're small little carvings, usually done out of bone or stone. But we start seeing these pop up. This one is from around 25,000 years ago in France. And then there are some other figurines that are always entertaining or interesting to talk about in class. And there are these kinds of figurines that we start finding all over Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, right? Around 25,000 years ago, we've got multiple figurines showing up. Sometimes they get the nickname Venus figurines. But again, these are appearing in multiple places over a few thousand years. And they're about this big. They're relatively small little human figures. So I would like to, discuss some possible explanations for these. What do you think the purpose of these are? Who's making them? Why? What's going on with these carvings? What would you think the purpose or meaning of these are? We can talk about them talk about your ideas in the discussion board this week. But there's usually some interesting ideas that come up from the class. So tell me what you think. You know, me being a primatologist, I tend to think in terms of other primates and apes. So, some of it reminds me of other things we've talked about with apes, but that's just the direction my mind wanders off into. What else do we see? We see jewelry starting to show up in a lot of sites all over the place, right? More symbolic items. And when we're finding an abundance of jewelry all over the place, it's again, we're thinking about why, right? Why are they going through the trouble to make objects like this and wear objects like this? What's the reason? What's the point, right? And when we find objects like this, who are they for, right? Who in the group is making them? Who in the group is wearing them? And what's the thinking behind this, right? So give me some ideas, again, in the discussion board for jewelry, okay? But with the cave art and the figures and the jewelry, I think we're probably going to see in the discussion board a lot of possible ideas and explanations. And I don't think it'll be too hard for you guys to come up with interesting ideas, because this idea of art and carvings and jewelry and the reasons to do it are very familiar to us, right? We can think of lots of reasons that humans do these kinds of things, because humans do these kinds of things for lots of different reasons now. So the idea is, when we're seeing these objects, 25, 30,000 years ago in the Paleolithic, we can assume, oh, the Homo sapiens at that time were thinking in the way that we were. They had modern minds and modern ways of thinking, because we're doing the things that people do, right? This sort of makes sense to us, right? It's familiar to us. So that is part of the evidence of modern ways of thinking during this time period. Compared to maybe like, why weren't Neanderthals making art? Why didn't they ever make jewelry? Why weren't they creative and symbolic in the same ways? Maybe they were thinking different from us. These people seem to be thinking very similar to us. Speaking of Neanderthals, remember a few weeks ago, we talked about Neanderthals and all the cool things they do. And one of the things I covered and we talked about in the lecture was that Neanderthals buried their dead sometimes, right? And we talked about some possibilities why Neanderthals would bury their dead. Were these practical burials, or whether it's just something more symbolic and spiritual or religious about it? And we talked about how Neanderthals didn't usually put anything in with the burials. It was just the body without any objects with them. This begins to change a bit with Homo sapiens. Okay, when we start looking at Homo sapien burials during this upper Paleolithic time period, we start to find the bodies are buried with stuff, right? So this picture at the top is an example of one of these burials from Russia, dated to about 25,000 years ago. And it's a little hard to tell in this picture, but they're buried with thousands of ivory beads, right? Ivory beads that look like this. And I've zoomed in on another burial with beads here that shows them a little bit more clearly. Now, they can't just go down to the mall and buy these beads. They have to make them all by hand, made from ivory. So anthropologists have reconstructed, how they made that and how long it would take to make each of these beads. And it's estimated that would have taken more than 10,000 hours of work to make the jewelry that these two individuals are wearing. Okay. So again, why? What's going on here? You guys give me some ideas in the discussion board this week about why they're going to be burying individuals with objects that at least are valuable in terms of time and effort that goes into making them, right? Why are Homo sapiens doing this? Again, there's a multiple possible ideas you guys can come up with, but I suspect you're going to come up with some ideas that, sort of seem familiar again and make sense, because human cultures around the world, a lot of them, or many of them, will bury objects with bodies. And there's various different reasons why cultures have these traditions of burying objects. So this is going on and has been going on with Homo sapiens, since the Upper Paleolithic, since, 20, 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens have been putting things in burials. Okay, so these kinds of things are the evidence that are often presented for this Upper Paleolithic cognitive revolution, right? Is saying during this time period, 40, 30, 20,000 years ago, especially up in Europe, we start seeing a lot of evidence that the people at this time, the Homo sapiens here, are thinking in modern ways that we recognize and understand, right? They're thinking abstractly and symbolically in very complex ways. They're making art, they're making jewelry, they're making figures, they're having elaborate burials, they have better tools, they have better weapons, right? This is the evidence for this Upper Paleolithic cognitive revolution, is that even though our bodies looked modern back here, this is where our brains became modern. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. The evidence and ideas behind the cognitive revolution hypothesis. But what I want to look at now is, well, are we sure that the brains back here were not modern and they were not thinking in the same ways? Was there really a delay and a split between bodies and brains? So that is my setup for the articles for this week. Okay. So there's two articles about cognitive abilities of modern humans, and then this is the Morning of the Modern Mind is about the cognitive abilities, and this one is about the migration and spread of Homo sapiens. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So as usual, again, you're familiar with this. This is the point of my lecture where I want you to pause and stop me. Stop looking at my lecture for a while. Go watch the student presentation, participate in their discussion board, answer their questions, and then come back and I will talk about some other things for the second half of the lecture. So enjoy the article presentation that the group has prepared for you this week. See you in a few minutes. All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and participated in the discussion. Now we will continue on. I'll sort of pick up where they left off and talk about some of these ideas a little bit more. Okay, so I was talking about the idea of an Upper Paleolithic cognitive revolution, and that had a lot to do with a lot of the arts, cave art and symbols and objects that have been found in parts of Europe from the Upper Paleolithic period. Well, it turns out that that is not the only place where we find objects like that, right? We find very interesting objects also in Africa, right? Complex tools and artwork and a lot of interesting stuff. And one of the articles, the Morning of the Modern Mind article, focuses on this site called Blombos Cave, which is in present-day South Africa. So that's a site here I want to mention, okay? Because there's interesting stuff going on there. What they found in Blombos Cave are complex tools that are, more sophisticated than they had assumed were from that time. And objects like jewelry, okay, these snail shells that are pierced to be strung together in bracelets or necklaces. So these are very interesting objects, similar to what we've been talking about, but they're not from Europe. They're from as far as you can get south in Africa, and they're not from 40,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago. They're from 75,000 years ago. So older than the stuff we were talking about before and located outside of Europe. And there's this interesting object down here. This is a rock. It's red ochre, right? It's this rock that they use to scrape and get this red dust from that they were able to use for pigment. And if you zoom in and look at the side of this, right, this is what we see along the side. So it looks like this top part is where they were scraping off the ochre, the pigment to use. But what's going on there? You guys have any ideas with what's happening here on the side of this rock? Have we ever seen anything like this before? Do you guys remember? The only thing I can think of was from a few weeks ago. Do you remember that etching in the Neanderthal cave? And we talked about what that might be. So again, if we were in class, we'd talk about this in person, but I'll, push it over to the discussion board and say, give me some ideas. What do you think's going on here on the side of this rock, from South Africa, 75,000 years ago, right? Is this symbolism? Is this art? Let me know what you think. So this one, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe we're not sure, but we do see other things that are much more clearly art, right? There's this, which looks clearly like a four-legged animal, maybe some kind of cat, I'm not sure. Maybe that's just because I think that people love to put cat memes out there, so maybe they've been doing lolcats for the past 25,000 years. But again, this is the same time period that we were talking about before, the Upper Paleolithic, but this is Namibia. This is in Africa, not up in Europe. Okay? And we find other types of artwork over in Indonesia. Okay. So these pictures these drawings are not all super well preserved, but what you can see in this top left one, there's sort of a pig-like animal here with a big round body and short little legs. There's a handprint up here in the upper right corner of this upper left picture. The animal figure over here in the right is much more easy to see. In this middle left picture, there's another animal down on the bottom right and some other figures and some clear handprints you can see there, and a whole bunch of handprints down on the bottom left. So there was some relatively recent research done just in 2019, and they dated, how they find the dates for these is sometimes they can date the actual material that the picture is drawn with, like if it's charcoal, they can date that. But the dating they did here was the mineral deposits done on top of the pictures, right? So they were able to date those, which means those came after, right? The deposit was dripped onto the picture afterwards. And the dates they get here are about 44,000 years ago. And again, Indonesia, right? Southeast Asia, way over near Australia. So if people are doing cave arts and handprints and figure drawings and animal drawings in Indonesia 44,000 years ago, that probably suggests art did not begin in Europe 25,000 years ago, right? Or even 30,000 years ago, or 40,000 years ago. Right? If you find similar artwork in two very distant places on a map, it is likely that that's because the Homo sapiens in both areas are getting this ability and this behavior from an ancestor, right? So this is suggesting that artwork probably has its origins much earlier in Africa and then spread into Europe and Asia. Hopefully that makes sense. So artwork is more diverse than just in Europe. And some interesting tools show up in other places. We start to find projectile points, specifically projectile points that you can attach to arrows to be shot with a bow. These, the oldest ones we have, last time I checked, were from about 64,000 years ago in South Africa. So again, fancy projectile weapons and projectile hunting, not from Europe 40,000 years ago, but from Africa 64,000 years ago. So the article highlights a bunch of evidence like this, right? And their point is a lot of these things that we have thought was indicative of a modern way of thinking and a very complex mind, right? Some of these are much older than the Upper Paleolithic, right? They're not 30 or 40,000 years ago. We're seeing things like fishing, exchange, points for projectile weapons coming much earlier than we had previously thought, okay? And again, so this is going against the revolution idea that it doesn't look like, 40,000 years ago, suddenly everything changed. It's like, no, there's probably a more gradual buildup in modern thinking and abilities that get pushed back much farther. And in looking at locations, so this chart is time. We're doing fancy stuff before the Upper Paleolithic, and we look at locations, we are finding symbolic artwork much more broadly. It's not just limited to Europe, right? We're finding it throughout Africa. We're finding it over here in Indonesia. Again, saying it doesn't look like a quick, rapid revolution happening during the Upper Paleolithic in Europe because we've got this all over the place. Again, suggesting a more gradual cognitive evolution. Okay. So this is all newer evidence than people had a few decades ago when they were coming up with the cognitive revolution idea. So now what we look back and see is, okay, the fossils we have for Homo sapiens. Yes, Homo and Herto here, and then we see them in Africa and the Near East, and then spreading elsewhere. Probably what's going on is the modern mind, the modern way of thinking is happening back here, right? And we probably have it during this time period. So now I want to ask you, why? Well, what are the reasons why our brains would be changing during this time period, right? If we're getting our fully modern way of thinking way back here, what could prompt changes in our brains and our ways of thinking? What have we seen in this class that could cause changes in hominin evolution? Whatever could it be? If you guessed climate change, hey, interestingly, this period is a period of very intense climate change, okay? And it looks like there were some drastic changes in the Homo sapien population during this time period. So let me show you what I'm talking about, or let me tell you what I'm talking about. So Homo sapiens, right, evolved 200,000 years ago in Africa. And they start spreading throughout Africa and doing their thing. But then around 130,000 years ago, a massive drought hits Africa, right? This is the millions, let's say, thousands of years of significant drought, right? The Sahara Desert opens up, forests, those lush rainforests are shrinking. We've seen this pattern of climate change before. So massive drought in Africa. And one thing to keep in mind is this is about the same time there is a ice age going on in Europe, right? So up in Europe, Heidelbergensis gets trapped during an ice age up there, and they're going to evolve into Neanderthals during this time period. What happens here in Africa is the Homo sapien population looks like it crashed, right? Is people start dying off. And it's hard to know for sure, but some genetic evidence suggests that our population may have dropped down to only 2,000 Homo sapiens left on Earth, right? So it looks like climate change almost made us go extinct. Almost so close. Maybe next time it'll get us. So our population crashed, but not everybody died, obviously. Okay. So who survived? One of the ideas here is the smartest survived. The people who could figure out how to survive in these tough, difficult conditions, right? Who figured out new food sources, new tools and weapons to get those food sources, probably new ways of working together and cooperating and bonding, right? This was a refining moment in Homo sapien evolution, was going through this bottleneck, right? This intense period of population reduction. And then, the drought lets up. It ends around 70,000 years ago. And the rains come back, Africa gets wet, northern latitudes get warm, and the human population starts growing again. And our numbers start increasing. And they never stopped, right? So this is the time period when our population expands and we start seeing Homo sapiens spread out and move out of Africa, probably with these new mental abilities, right? With a fully modern mind and fully modern way of thinking. That's what got us through this mega drought and let us expand and spread. So that's the idea of what's going on here, is that, our brains had been evolving and they probably got refined back here in Africa around 100,000 years ago to survive this population crash and drought. And then we took that modern mind and spread, and brought our fancy tools and our fancy art and our symbolic ways of thinking out to these other areas. And it wasn't a quick, rapid change that just happened in Europe. Okay, that makes sense to you guys? If not, ask me for clarification over in the discussion. I'm happy to clarify, but hopefully that idea is clear. Okay, so that's the cognitive abilities article. Now we can look at how Homo sapiens are spreading around. Right? So we can look at some of the details of the evolution and spread of Homo sapiens. And what we're going to look at here is the debate about when and where the very first Homo sapiens evolved, the timing of when they migrated to new areas, and the idea of when they moved into new areas and met other species. Did they mate with them or did they just sort of wipe them out? Okay, so these ideas we're going to look at. So this is the other article for the week, the New View of the Birth of Homo Sapiens article. And what they set up there is that there have been historically in anthropology two competing theories or hypotheses about the origins of our species. And the first one is called the multi-regional theory. And what this theory is, I'll explain this, is Homo erectus had evolved in Africa and spread into Asia and Europe. And then Homo erectus evolved into Heidelbergensis in Africa and Europe and Asia. Okay. So when we're looking at our species, the multi-regional theory says Homo sapiens evolved in multiple regions. We evolved simultaneously in Europe and Africa and in Asia. Okay. All the Erectus and Heidelbergensis evolved into Homo sapiens. Okay. So the local populations around were not replaced by Homo sapiens, they evolved into Homo sapiens. Because what this theory assumes is that there was genes flowing all the way through. Okay. All of these populations were connected to each other. So genes could flow from Africa into Asia, and genes could flow from Asia into Europe and to Africa, and from Europe into Asia, right? Everybody's mating with everybody. It's a one big breeding population. So our species evolved in multiple regions sort of simultaneously. The whole population, the whole global population of Erectus and Heidelbergensis all evolved into Homo sapiens. Okay, does that make sense? Multiple regions, our origins are from everywhere. That's where our species comes from, thanks to this frequent mating and gene flow. So that's one theory of our origins. The other one, and this is put in opposition to multi-regional, is called the out of Africa replacement theory. Okay. And this says, no, multi-regional is wrong. Okay. Our species, Homo sapiens, evolved as a distinct species in Africa only. Right? The Heidelbergensis living in Africa evolved into Homo sapiens. Then Homo sapiens spread out and replaced everybody else, wiped them out, either outcompeted them or, fought them, but just replaced them. So everybody else, Heidelbergensis, Erectus, Neanderthals, everybody goes extinct because Homo sapiens replaced them. And they didn't interbreed with, Heidelbergensis and Erectus and Neanderthals and hobbits and all that stuff because, ew, other species, gross. Who's going to mate with a different species? We just replace them. Okay, so do you see the difference between these two theories? The multi-regional origin of our species versus the out of Africa, and then replace everybody else. So these have been sort of the two main theories for explaining our origins. So this is science, and this is a science debate of which theory is correct. So when we're looking at debates in science, we have to turn to the evidence, okay, and see which one has the best evidence. That's how we decide between scientific theories is, we look at evidence, not convincing YouTube videos and Facebook posts. Okay. So for science, the evidence we're looking at here is there are two main types of evidence we can look at. We can look at fossils and we can look at genetics to address these two competing theories. So I will start with fossils, okay, because we've talked about this a bunch before. All right, so keeping in mind these two theories, multi-regional, where Homo sapiens evolve everywhere all at the same time, versus out of Africa, evolving in Africa and then replacing everybody. Let's look at our fossils of Homo sapiens. So here's our timeline and our location. There's the fossils that we found in Homo, Kabish, and Herto. There's the Homo sapien fossils later in Africa and into the Middle East. Then Homo sapien fossils start showing up in Asia and then in Europe. So looking at those fossils, which theory does that look like? Does that look like multi-regional evolution, where Homo sapiens evolved everywhere 200,000 years ago? Or does that look like out of Africa and then spread and replacement? I have to say the out of Africa theorists are very pleased with this fossil evidence. They say, look, we evolved in Africa and then we spread out. Okay. So they say, see, there's no Homo sapiens in Asia or Europe, 150,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, right? Out of Africa says, why are there no fossils of Homo sapiens here? Because they didn't evolve there. They evolved in Africa and didn't get there till much later. Okay, so that's the out of Africa perspective on the fossil record. Okay. But to be fair, the multi-regionalists don't give up that easily. Okay, the multi-regionalists have an explanation or have a potential explanation for why we don't have Homo sapien fossils in Asia, 150,000 years ago. Why? Can you guess? What would be a multi-regional explanation for why this is blank? What it is the idea of the difference between evidence of absence and absence of evidence. Out of Africa says, this is evidence of absence. The lack of fossils here are evidence that Homo sapiens were not there. They were absent from that area. Multi-regionalists just say, no, this is just an absence of evidence. We don't have any fossils from Homo sapien fossils from 150,000 years ago in China because we haven't found them yet. We might next year, We haven't looked everywhere. We haven't dug up the whole planet. There may be plenty of Homo sapien fossils in these other areas that we just haven't dug up yet. So basically their argument is be patient. We're probably going to find more Homo sapien fossils later. And then, then you'll see that you are wrong because we'll find some old Homo sapiens in these other places. Okay. So, you can take that for what you will, right? And you can decide which the evidence seems to better support, out of Africa or multi-regional there. Okay, so that's the fossil evidence. Now, genetic evidence. Let me talk about that for a moment. Okay, there's different kinds of genetic evidence, but this can, you can look at the DNA of modern people and they can show you some interesting things. And some of this you can get evidence from studying modern people with those DNA analysis, those gene analysis projects like the Genographic Project or 23andMe, things like that, that look at genetic variation and ancestry. So what comes out of those is this idea of a molecular clock. Okay, and they mentioned this in the article. So I want to explain this. This has to do with mutations. Remember, beginning of the semester, our genetics week, I talked about mutations because mutations are super important for everything we're doing this semester. So this is looking at mutations, and it is saying how to explain this clearly and succinctly. Mutations are random. They're natural. They're always happening, okay? And they happen at about the same rate most of the time, especially over long periods of time. So what this is saying is that if you were to look at a population of animals, right, and study them, right, you could sort of oversimplify it and say, over a 10-year period, you could expect 10 new mutations to pop up in that species, right? And over 100 years, maybe you'd see 100 new mutations. Over 1,000 years, you'd see 1,000 new mutations. Okay? So that's what it's saying is over time, mutations build up, right? At a roughly equal rate. So what you can do is compare different species or different groups of the same species and look at the mutations you find in those groups, right? And you can just count how many mutations there are. It's like, oh, this group has this many, this group has this many differences. They have 100 differences, so they've been split apart for 100 years, accumulating mutations. That's the idea, is mutations will build up in a group over time. And you can get a rough estimate of how long that group has been distinct by how many mutations they have that separate them from other groups. Hopefully that makes sense. It's always hard to know in this kind of format, but if it's not clear, ask me in the discussion board. I'll try to clarify. Okay, so what they've done is they've taken this idea of mutations accumulate over time, and they've studied living populations of people all around the world, okay? And they've sampled people from everywhere on Earth, and they looked to see how many mutations are in these different populations, in these different groups of people around the world. And the interesting result they found here is that of all the people in the world, Africans tend to be the most genetically diverse people, okay? They have more diversity in their DNA, and diversity is mutations, right? There are more mutations there than in any other group. There's fewer mutations in every other group. So what that means, this diversity seen in African populations tied into the molecular clock idea is, oh, if they've got the most diversity, they've been accumulating that diversity for the longest amount of time. So this shows us that Africans are the oldest family lineages, right? Because they've been around the longest, they've accumulated the most diversity in their DNA. All the other branches and lineages have less diversity, so they're younger groups. Hopefully that makes sense. Older groups have more diversity. Then you'll also see in these genetic studies and in the readings, they can pick out individual markers, right? Markers or mutations in the DNA and sort of trace them and say, oh, this group over here has this marker. Oh, so does this group and this group, but this one doesn't. So they can make connections and tie groups together and sort of compare and trace lineages and get dates for some of these mutations. And the two that usually come up in these discussions are there is a marker, a mutation in the mitochondria. That's the part of your cell that's a little energy, a little battery. I think I talked about that during that genetics week, saying, hey, I'm going to talk about mitochondria later in the semester. The mitochondria has a little bit of DNA. There's a marker there, a mutation that popped up that every human being on the planet has, right? And they've traced that back to African origins at around 200,000 years ago is when that little mutation popped up in mitochondria and then spread to every human on the planet. So that's the oldest shared marker that all humans have, is this mitochondrial Eve marker 200,000 years ago. And then they've got another marker that they've identified in the Y chromosome. Remember the sex chromosomes, X and Y. If you have two X, you're female. If you have an X and a Y, you're male. So they found a genetic marker, a little mutation in the Y chromosome that all men on the planet currently have. That marker has been traced back to Africa at about 60,000 years ago. So it's a younger mutation, but the lineages trace it back there. So this evidence all shows that Africa has the oldest lineages of people on Earth, and all the other populations are younger. So which theory does this look like it supports? The multi-regional, we all evolved in all the regions together, or we started in Africa and then spread out? Again, the out of Africa people are like, we got the genetic evidence too. Woohoo, suck on that, multi-regionalists. The genetic evidence does look really good for the out of Africa theory. Okay, but I want to remind you of one of the things that the out of Africa theory said. The out of Africa replacement theory said, Our species originated in Africa. Then we migrated out and we replaced all the other species without interbreeding with them. So now let's look at that aspect of it. What about that interbreeding with earlier hominins, right? And this brings us back to our old friends, the Neanderthals, from a couple of weeks ago. You guys remember Neanderthals? I hope so. They're awesome. Okay, so Homo sapiens met Neanderthals, right? So here we are in our little family tree. Here we are, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So let's talk about Neanderthals. You remember those guys? They evolved up in Europe during the Ice Age around 150,000 years ago. And they last for like a good 100,000 years, but they go extinct around 30,000 years ago. What happened to Neanderthals? Why did they go extinct? We talked about a lot of ideas about that a couple of weeks ago. Climate change was happening, right? They were specialized and really well adapted to the cold. So maybe when climate warmed up, it was harder for them because they were built to stay warm when it's really cold. In the heat, they'd struggled. The habitat may have changed, right? They were ambush hunters who had to sneak up on their prey to stab them. When the climate changed and opened it up to open grasslands instead of forests, it's harder for them to hunt. And it does look like they were living in relatively small groups, somewhat isolated from each other. So climate was probably taking its toll on Neanderthals throughout their whole existence and giving them a hard time. But then we got Homo sapiens, right? Homo sapiens, according to this idea, the out of Africa ideas, we left Africa around 60,000 years ago, and we reached Europe around 40,000 years ago. So both species, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, lived together in Europe for about 10,000 years. And we talked about ideas of, what happened when they met. Okay. How did things go while they spent time together? And I remember we talked about in the discussions, definitely there was probably competition for resources and some, occasional hostility going on. So we can revisit this idea though. Did Homo sapiens mate with Neanderthals? Okay. To answer this question, there are again two lines of evidence, fossils and genetics. If you look at fossils, right, this would be morphological, body shape, physical evidence of fossils. So what we see here are some interesting finds. They found the fossil of a 4-year-old kid from Portugal about 25,000 years ago. So what they see in this kid is this kid seems to have some Neanderthal features, right? He's like a little short and stocky, and his head's kind of, his skull's a little bit more Neanderthal shaped looking. So what does that mean? This 4-year-old 25,000 years ago has some Neanderthal features. Maybe he's part Neanderthal, right? Hey, that could be evidence of mating with Neanderthals. Is that kid's inherited Neanderthal features? But other researchers say, come on, don't pick on that kid. Don't say his grandpa was a Neanderthal. He's just big bones. He's just a little husky for his age. Maybe it's just individual variation. He's just thick. Okay. And so basically they've got a few other skeletons like that around Europe that do seem to show a few Neanderthal traits. So for some researchers, this suggests maybe there's some hybrids out there, right? Some of these fossils do look a little mixed. Other researchers say, they're just big bones. Don't worry about it. Okay, so that's the fossil evidence saying maybe, but not conclusive. Okay, if we look at the genetic evidence, what we see there is the early genetic studies, when they first started pulling DNA out of Neanderthal fossils and looking at them, the early studies suggested no. okay, because they pulled little snippets of Neanderthal DNA and lined it up with humans and said, no, it's different. And this, I want to remind you, the articles that you read for the Neanderthal Week, both articles were a few years old. One of the articles I think was written in 2009, okay? And it mentioned, hey, we've looked for Neanderthal genes. We don't see much. But that article, I think it was the Twilight of the Neanderthals article, it said in that article, next year, they're going to publish the full Neanderthal genome and maybe we'll find out more. So that's what happened. After your Neanderthal article reading was published, the next year, in April of 2010, the full Neanderthal genome was sequenced. Okay. And what did they find when they compared the full Neanderthal DNA sequence with the full Homo sapiens sequence? Anybody know? Maybe you know. They found, yep, there are Neanderthal genes in modern Homo sapiens. There's some matches there. Not a ton, but some, okay? What they find is for people of European or Asian descent, so if you've got any European or Asian ancestry in you, you have probably between 1 to 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal genes. The only people who generally do not have Neanderthal genes are people of pure sub-Saharan African descent, because Neanderthals were not there, right? Neanderthals lived in Europe and the Middle East. So anybody whose ancestors passed through the Middle East on their way to Asia or came into Europe mingled with Neanderthals, okay? So not a lot, not a ton of mating. But so they estimate at least 3 different times in 3 different locations. There was some mating that resulted in hybrid kids who then went on to have kids who went on to have kids, right? So there could have been other mating instances where the kids did not go on to pass their genes, but at least 3 times your ancestors had sex with Neanderthals. You know, and you can imagine why they would do that. You know, what the scenario there, whether you're going to imagine, you know, an open-minded one time at college kind of scenario, or, you know, Romeo and Juliet, forbidden love between 2 different tribes, or, you know, a non-consensual conflict type mating. But yeah, it happened. So again, if you do those DNA analysis studies like 23andMe or something, you can usually find out how much Neanderthal you have in there. I think mine was about 2.5%. So, okay. So I want to mention they've done this Neanderthal DNA research is constantly being updated. There's always new stuff coming out. So some of the things I've seen in the past few semesters coming out of that about Neanderthal DNA studies is it looks like the genetic evidence suggests they probably had light skin and many of them might have had red hair. And which genes do we share with them? It looks like some of the genes are involved with our immune system. So that research is still being looked at, but we do seem to have inherited a little bits and pieces of the Neanderthal immune system. Back in 2016, they had a bunch of results coming out that year. What they found at first was that there was no Neanderthal genes in modern Homo sapien male Y chromosomes. So this result suggested maybe male Neanderthals did not mate with female Homo sapiens. Basically, male Neanderthals didn't pass on any Y chromosome genes. right? Or maybe they did try, they didn't mate, but there were problems and those kids didn't get passed on. So this result, just suggests it may have been more often that it was male Homo sapiens mating with female Neanderthals. But again, this is not definitive, but it's some interesting possibilities here. And then that same year, I saw this headline pop up: humans gave Neanderthals herpes. What they looked at here was that they analyzed the herpes DNA, and they found out that originated in Africa 1.6 million years ago. Plus, some other diseases have early genetic origins. So that's suggesting that maybe when Homo sapiens moved into Europe, they brought tropical diseases with them when they came in, and they gave diseases to Neanderthals, and that could have caused Neanderthals some trouble and maybe helped lead to their extinction. But if you watch the news or read the news and have your news set for the keywords for Neanderthals, there's always new stuff coming out. These results are a few years old, but they were kind of interesting. But I'm sure there are going to be more results coming out this year and next year, and they're continuing to look at this. Okay, so what else should I mention? Oh, right, Denisovans. Okay, so what's going on here? There's this site, okay? Denisova Cave up here in Russia, in what's now modern Siberia. Okay? They found a finger bone, a piece of a finger in 2010. And it's dated to 41,000 years ago. And I remember when this research came out in 2010, I was teaching this class, and I was like, I'm not going to talk about one pinky bone in my class. That's annoying. That's not enough to deal with. I'll just ignore that. Okay. But then they were able to extract some DNA from that pinky bone. Okay. So what would we expect? Whose DNA would we expect to find in Siberia 40,000 years ago? Yeah. Any guesses? Who liked to live in cold weather 40,000 years ago? Neanderthals? That'd be interesting. We didn't think Neanderthals pushed that far east, but could be Neanderthals, or could be Homo sapiens, living up there. That's fine too. So they analyzed the DNA, and what they found was it's not Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. It's a different set of DNA that's distinct from both of them. So it's like, oh, maybe is this a third species? Something different up there? But it did show some evidence of interbreeding with Neanderthals. So they had some Neanderthal genes in there. And interesting, the article says this Denisovan DNA, you can find traces of it now in people over here in Melanesia. So this began the discussion of maybe this Denisovans are another species of hominins living during this time that we haven't talked about at all, and we only know from a pinky bone. Then you remember the Cima de los Huesos sinkhole site in Spain that I talked about? Remember the sinkhole with all the bones at the bottom? They did some analysis on the bones there. Okay, we talked about that during the Hominin Enigmas week, I don't know how many weeks ago that was. That was a little while ago. So they extracted some DNA from one of the femurs there. And this so far is some of the oldest DNA I've ever seen them be able to pull out. It was 300,000 years ago. So the assumptions were here. I presented the sinkhole site as Heidelbergensis that week, but some people call these early Neanderthals, so that's fine. When they pulled the DNA out and looked at it, what did the DNA look like? It looked like the Denisovan DNA. That's what it matched, the group over here. So that result came out in 2013. I was like, oh, I don't know what to do about that. But then they pulled a little more. So that was from the mitochondria. Then in 2015, they got some nuclear DNA. That looks very similar to Neanderthal DNA. And then in 2016, they got some more DNA, and that shows some interbreeding between the groups and some mixing and mingling going on. So that sinkhole was a weird and interesting site when I talked about it a few weeks ago. Genetic evidence is making it even more interesting. And then I'll add in here very recently, this isn't in any of your readings, and I don't even think it's in the textbook, right? It's not in the latest edition of the textbook because it's too new. So what they found there is over in Tibet, right, here in China, they found there was this broken jawbone with a couple of teeth in it. It had been found back in 1980, right? But it only got analyzed in 2019. And when they analyzed this little jaw fragment and a couple of teeth that a Tibetan monk had found, what did they find? That thing was 160,000 years ago, and the DNA matched the Denisovan DNA. So Denisovans are this new possible thing that at some point in the near future, if they find some more fossils, I'm probably going to have a week on Denisovans because this evidence seems to be building, but I'm not sure what's going on here just quite yet. But I wanted to mention that and give you some updates and more recent research. Okay, so back to the debate. Okay, I set this up with, there was this whole debate between the origins of Homo sapiens. Multi-regional theory versus out of Africa theory. Okay. And I said, this is a debate in science between these two theories. We have to look at the evidence and see which theory is best supported by the evidence. And what does it look like? A lot of the evidence backs the out of Africa theory, right? The fossils look to be out of Africa. The genetic data showing our origins, the diversity in Africa, everything traces back to Africa. Africa is the oldest theory, okay? But the more recent genetic evidence, when we look at this last statement, did not interbreed with other Homo species. The genetic evidence seems to say there is interbreeding going on. Okay. Maybe not quite as much as the multi-regional idea said, where everybody's one giant breeding population, we evolved everywhere. Okay, so what happens in science when the theory does not fully fit the evidence? Okay. Unlike modern politics, where you just ignore the evidence or claim the evidence is fake news, or make up some other crap like that. In science, what you have to do is say, oh, I guess my theory is not completely correct. The evidence is good. You modify the theory, okay? So you take these two old theories and you say, well, here's the evidence. We have to come up with a new third theory, okay? So the new theory that best fits the evidence is the mostly out of Africa theory, also known as the leaky replacement theory, okay? So this is now the current best supported theory that we have, is this new one, this modified theory. Okay, so what this theory says, according to the evidence we have, yes, we evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago, okay? We evolved there. Homo sapiens stayed in Africa for the next 140,000 years. And during that time, there was that massive drought. our population crashed, the intense selection pressure and bottleneck there. We had some cognitive changes. We got our fully modern minds. We started developing new tools and symbolic thinking and art and all that stuff. And we survived the drought. Our population starts to grow. So then we expand out of Africa about 60,000 years ago, move over into Asia. Later on, they'll move into Australia and Europe and the Americas. And as Homo sapiens spread around and met some of those other species of hominins, it looks like there was some limited interbreeding that occurred, right? Between the new African Homo sapiens and the other Homo species. Like, we know for sure we mated with Neanderthals occasionally, Denisovans, probably Heidelbergensis. Probably within the next few years, they're going to figure out that we mated with those hobbits too, because you know how humans are. They'll try anything. But still, the bulk of our DNA and our genes come from African origins. So about 90% of our DNA is that African origin with, a little Neanderthal, a little Denisovan, a little Heidelbergensis, little other things mixed in there to sort of finish it off. Okay? So that's now the current best supported theory, is the mostly out of Africa theory. And the new view of the birth of Homo sapiens gives you this little chart. If you're a visual person, maybe this helps. Right? Multi-regional theory was saying, Homo erectus spread out, and then everybody, Africans, European, Asians, and Australian populations were all mating and mixing together, right? And we evolved as one global species. Out of Africa theory said, oh no, Homo erectus moved out into, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Homo sapiens originate in Africa and then come out and replace everybody else. The new third theory says, we originated in Africa, and we originated there and spread out, but there was occasional little mixes of some genes coming back in from those other groups, but still mostly African origins with just some few leaks in from other species. Okay, so hopefully that gives you enough information to answer that part of the exam question this week, right? Talking about multi-regional versus out of Africa compared to the new third best supported theory out there right now, mostly out of Africa, leaky replacements. And then tie that into the cognitive changes that we talked about in the first part of this lecture, the cognitive revolution versus the outdated cognitive revolution idea versus the more gradual cognitive evolution idea. Okay, so we end up therefore with this idea is we originate in Africa 200,000 years ago, spread out around 60,000 years ago, move into Asia about 50,000 years ago, then Australia 45,000 years ago, into Europe 40,000 years ago, where we met some Neanderthals and apparently got along with them well enough to mate here and there. And it wasn't until very recently, like 15,000 years ago, that we moved into North America through the land bridge here and started spreading through the Americas. Okay, so that's the overview of the timeline for this week. Hopefully you enjoyed that lecture. And again, we got lots to talk about with, art and symbolism and that kind of stuff over in the discussion board this week. Next week, what we'll do is, now that we have Homo sapiens spread out into all these different areas of the world, we're going to look at some interesting biological variations between different people in different geographical regions. So we're going to talk about ideas about like race and gender next week. So hopefully you will enjoy that. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope you learned a lot and found it interesting. Bye.